Hello, and it's day 10 of the TooFatLardies 2024 Advent Calendar. Thank you for joining us once again, and we hope you're enjoying this series of little snippets that we're able to provide you, thanks to the elves who created the Advent Calendar. Well, it falls to me to open the next window and have a look what's inside. Let's have a look here. You're my favourite. What is it that draws you to your own personal favourite wargaming period? Well, that's a difficult one, actually, because my knee-jerk reaction is to say I don't have a personal favourite wargaming period. Or if I do, it's simply the one that I'm currently researching or painting for or building for. I am, by no stretch of the imagination, monogamous when it comes to wargaming. In fact, I'm a bit of a tart. I'm quite capable of falling deeply in love with any new period that catches my eye. And catch my eye they do. In fact, the hardest part is maintaining the discipline to keep me on track to get one project finished before I start another. It's why when Nick says he loves Wargames magazines because he's forever looking at the reviews of figures and adverts, I try and avoid those because I know how easily I am diverted. So I stick to the articles and stay firmly away from the adverts and the figure reviews. I guess, I mean, if the modern era began with the birth of Jesus Christ, I guess we could say a period is as long as a piece of string. And if that were the case, my favourite period began in, 1848 technically, but let's say the 1860s, and continues till today. That might be stretching it a little bit in terms of describing that as a single period, but what began it was the introduction of the breech-loading rifle on the battlefield. Prussia introduced the Drace needle gun in 1848, and I think they used it for the first time in anger against the Danes in 1864, but they had a rather small c conservative leadership running that campaign, and it didn't really come into its own until 1866 when they took on the Austrians. This is a war you'll often hear me talking about, and the reason for that is this was when the Austrians stood in line with their rifle muzzle loaders, but the Prussians formed what they called the Schwarm, which is a dense, thick skirmish line of troops in open order using their breech-loading rifle, able to fire and reload from a prone position. And this is the point where infantry tactics changed, the point where standing in line so that your officers could have absolute control over you, maybe directing when it was you fired by volley, disappeared. And the infantrymen themselves decided when they fired and how quickly they reload and how quickly they use their ammunition. And that presented all sorts of problems. And there were all sorts of arguments about those problems. In the Prussian army after 1866 and again after the war against France in 1870 and 71, there was a huge argument about whether the dispersed formations, which were great for reducing casualties amongst the Prussian infantrymen, but were terrible for when it came to their leaders being able to maintain command and control on the battlefield. What would happen was that the Schwarm would disperse and the infantrymen would make their own tactical decisions about when they advanced and when they stood still and when they lay down and when they fired. And then when the officers decided that the enemy was overwhelmed by the firefight, they were simply unable to get their battalion or company to advance forward with fixed bayonet to finish the job off. And also there were issues with the overuse of ammunition, which have always been discussed throughout all wars in history, and is the reason why the British Army went with the SLR rather than the fully automatic FN. It's an argument that still was continuing in the war in Afghanistan. But this argument over control and order actually happened again with the British Army in the Boer War in their first experience. If you look at what they were doing only a few years before when they were fighting in the Sudan, the British Army, at this point in time, dressed in their drab khaki, was still fighting shoulder to shoulder. When they tried that against the Boers, they certainly discovered that it was unwise, and very rapidly the frontage was expanded and expanded again in order to reduce casualties. And it created a situation with smokeless powder where the empty battlefield emerged. This was interesting because there was a continuity in the theme here as we went from one war to another war. What happened was that the tactics began to emerge and change very, very slightly. As a child, I grew up visiting my grandmother's house, which was full of books on the Great War, on the First World War, which was my grandfather's war. My grandfather was much older than me. He was born in 1880, which makes me sound extraordinarily old, but he really was. And he was one of 7 brothers who signed up to fight in the Great War, and he was wounded on the first day of the Battle of 3rd Ypres at Passchendaele, and actually spent 2 years in a hospital, eventually in Anglesey, having his ankle rebuilt, where it was assumed he'd been hit by a machine gun bullet that was firing at that low level. And his life was actually saved by some German prisoners of war who'd been sent to clear out the bunkers and trenches of any men and shell holes of any men who'd fallen down and been wounded, and he was brought in after about 2 days, lying initially in a shell hole and then in a German bunker which he'd managed to crawl to. And that war almost felt tangible to me, although my grandfather actually died 5 days before I was born, and my father would tell me tales of my grandfather, but it was never quite the same as meeting him. But nevertheless, it felt close. It felt tangible because somebody to whom I had a very personal point of contact, and him dying and me being born in the same week, it makes it very personal. You almost feel like he moved over to make room for me. But that led to me doing a lot of research into infantry tactics and their development in the Great War. The First World War is often seen as a period of lunacy and almost criminality in terms of the way that the men were treated and fed into this sausage machine. Of course, the problem is the sausage machine is actually mythical. And the First World War was a period of intense development, huge changes, and the British Army showed incredible interest in developing ideas and asking people right the way up the chain what they thought of their experiences and what they thought could do better. There were printed questionnaires which were handed out after every action in order to try and find a solution to the problems of the First World War, which were that weapons had developed at such a pace and continued to develop at such a pace. But infantry tactics were yet to keep up with them, hence the large losses that were typical of the period of early and mid-war, but which dropped off as the war continued as better tactics were discovered. And it was the development there of small infantry unit tactics that I found incredibly interesting, but still slightly removed. World War II, on the other hand, for somebody of my age, born in the 60s, felt very, very close indeed, because we knew the people. We knew them at home. My father had had a reserved occupation. In 1939, my father had left school aged 15, and he had got a job with Post Office Telecommunications, which saw him posted to the sunny Isle of Wight, which was fabulous, as a civilian contractor on Ventnor radar station. And as a 16-year-old, he was on Ventnor when it was knocked out by the Germans who were attacking during the Battle of Britain. And I don't know if it was those experiences that inspired him to give up a reserved occupation and volunteer to join the Royal Air Force as a pilot. And he had some fabulous experiences doing that, not least travelling across the Atlantic and travelling right the way through Canada and down into the United States, where he undertook his flight training in Arizona and made friends who lasted for life. And when I grew up, these USAAF instructors would come and visit us on a regular basis when they came to visit the UK. So we knew these people. My uncle was on the Burma Railway, as I've recited before. But more importantly, my RE master had been at Monte Cassino. My Latin master was so old, he's such a crusty old boy, that he was a veteran of the Great War and the Kaiserschlacht of 1918. But generally, the older schoolmasters had been involved during the Second World War. For my O-level project, I interviewed men who'd been in France with the British Expeditionary Force in 1939 and 1940, and who had escaped via Dunkirk. Even when I first went to work, when we returned to the UK from abroad, in the early 1980s, I was given a lift to work by a guy who was a Canadian Mosquito pilot who'd stayed here after the war. When I got to work, I worked alongside a guy who'd been a veteran of Dunkirk and North Africa and the Italy campaign. These weren't issues that we laboured on extensively, but they were there, and by a process of osmosis, we understood and got to know about the things that they experienced, and the tactics and the weapons used weren't that different to the ones that were used in the officer training corps at school. The Lee Enfield rifle, the Bren gun, was still in service in the British Army through to the first Gulf War on some vehicles in 1991. The Vickers was only phased out in 1968. So for somebody born in the 60s, these were really quite contemporary. And the people were there in our lives, providing us with that contact. And of course, the volume of information was available, not just in terms of books and histories, but in fact is still there today in the obituary pages of the broadsheets and the quality newspapers, where we find still stories of heroism that have me reaching for my maps and historical accounts to learn more about those individuals and learn more about the actions that they took part in. So for me, if I had to choose a period, I guess it would have to be that Second World War, which was still living and breathing when I was a young man. But it isn't just that information was available and those people were there. It's what that war was fought for that I think had a deep and lasting impression on me. For my generation, World War II cast a long shadow, longer than many other wars that some of us have observed or even been involved in. Some of the smaller wars leave their scars, often personal and often private, and the impact of some of those still lives on. But this was a global war, and it was a great war between 1939 and 1945, when the nations of the free world stood shoulder to shoulder against the seemingly unstoppable juggernaut of fascism and nationalism. And together, we thought, had vanquished those foes and made the world a safer place for my generation to grow up in. I find it impossible not to look at World War II and to consider it to be the ultimate crusade between good and evil, a truly just war, which is something we cannot often say about conflicts, where black and white are more often replaced with shades of grey. Knowing that the people we study were largely civilians who left behind their normal lives, like my father, to oppose those particular evils, makes their exploits all the more noteworthy and all the more worth celebrating and remembering through our war games.